No, it's time for top three new decks of the week. What's up, everybody? Feels good to do the song again. I know how much you love it. But anyway, you might be asking yourself, hey, Dev. I guess you should be asking me in that case, but it's convenient. I'm here, so I might as well answer your questions. Hey, Dev, Final Fantasy just came out like 5 days ago on digital clients. Because that's how people talk. You would say digital client to me face to face. But anyway, Final Fantasy just came out like 5 days ago. Looks kind of weak to me in standard. Anything showing up? Well, much to everyone's surprise, including my own, a little bit. A lot of Final Fantasy cards are showing up in standard, and some decks even have multiple Final Fantasy cards in them. Gasp, amazingly. So let's look at 3 decks that I found to be really cool from over this last 5 days or so that we have access to results from. So with that said, let's look at Grul Terra first. Old Terra.deck. This got 9th place in a standard challenge on the 14th by Owl1013 or Owl1013. I'm not sure which one it is, but good job on the almost top 8 finish for a kind of brand new deck. But honestly, Terra is slotting into the deck that we all figured she would slot into the most easily, and that is a Grul Delirium package, mostly because of her interaction with fear of missing out. So in case you've missed Terra, quick rundown is that she's a 3-mana 4/2. When she enters, mill 5, and then you get an enchantment card that you milled this way. If you pay 6 mana, you turn her over into this 6/6 flying thing. It's a saga, and on the first 3 chapters, you create a token that's a copy of a non-legendary enchantment you control. It gains haste, sack it, end of turn. So this, and you can also put up to 3 lore counters on it if it's a saga, which might matter with the one saga we're playing. More on that in a second. But if you get to chapter 4, this gives you double Wooburg, and then it becomes Terra Magical Adept again, so you get the mill and the enchantment. Overall, a strong card that both halves of want you to play, with enchantments. Let's optimize enchantments in the deck. Interestingly, there's only 9 main deck enchantments in this entire list here. One of them being, of course, Fear of Missing Out, which is great with Terra because you can copy it every turn and get multiple, attack steps, which is really, really cool. But it works well with Terra once she gets swinging as a 6/6 flyer, because if you get 2 attack steps with a 6/6 flyer, then you probably win the game, especially with a trick that I'll show you a little bit later in the video here. But obviously this is the best interaction in the deck and the best reason to play a new card, but there's also Summon Brynhildr, which I guess Terra works with well too. Both on curve, because you play Brynhildr into Terra, give the Terra haste, that's kind of cool. But also because, Terra can copy the Brynhildr and it kind of draws you cards. If you want to, you can put more, lore counters on the Brynhildr and then play a creature to give it haste. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this card in this deck. So it's a 2-mana 2/1. On chapter 1, you're going to exile the top of your library. You can play the card as long as you are putting lore counters on this. So even the last turn that you put a lore counter on it and it goes to your graveyard, you can still play the card that it exiled for you. So it's basically a 2-mana draw card when it comes into play. It's very, very good. But on the last 2 chapters, it just gives a creature haste the next time you play a creature that turn. So again, that can be really good depending on what you're doing. On curve, this can do some fun stuff like Omnivorous Flytrap. Just a 2 of this card, and you don't always see it in this deck, but this helps us go over the top, something that the deck kind of needs to be able to do, especially once we start getting in the trenches, that war of attrition against all the other aggro decks. This will help bust us out. So when it enters aura attacks, if there are 4 or more card types among cards, if we have delirium, then we distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 creatures. But if there are 6 or more card types, we get the double the number of +1/+1 counters on those creatures. That probably won't happen too often, but we will have delirium fairly reliably here. I like that Summon Brynhildr can give Ominous Flytrap, haste the turn it comes into play, and then suddenly you're getting in for a fair amount of damage on turn 3. That's not so bad. But Patchwork Bestie and WWF Wildfire Wickerfolk also help you get in a lot of sort of early damage, and in the case of Patchwork Bestie, helps you get your delirium quickly. Pretty much the only other new addition to the deck that's apart from the shell is a Keen-Eyed Curator. This will help us keep Omniscience out of our opponent's graveyard, which is really cool. But this can also get really big just by playing around in our own graveyard if we've already got delirium, right? Or if just delirium doesn't matter that much to us. If we'd rather have a 7/7, let's just do that, right? So, cool addition to the deck that keeps us off of maybe our absolute worst matchup in Omniscience. I kind of like that. But we've also got Breakout in the deck to find all of our 2-drops. Bushwhack is our only removal spell, so we're really riding the lightning in the deck. Monstrous Rage is a good pump spell, but we're only playing 1 because we're actually putting a lot of our chips into the Violent Urge basket here as far as pump spells go, at least. This gives a creature +1/+0 in first strike no matter what, but if we have Delirium, that creature also just gains double strike until end of turn. So that means that there's a line in the deck that allows us to go, Terra with fear of missing out, get an extra attack step with Terra, and if we Violent Urge on that first attack step, I think she can do a total of 28 damage in one turn. So that's a pretty good OTK possibility. And maybe I'm doing my math wrong, but she gets +1/+0, so she goes to 7. She gets double strike, so she's doing 14 damage in the first attack step, 14 damage in the second attack step. So again, that should be 28 damage, and you can kill your opponent even if they're above their starting life total. But Urge just works with all the creatures in the deck. If we put it on a WWF or something, suddenly we're doing 8 damage with that guy. But with stuff like the Hydra, right, we can put +1/+1 counters on things. We can combo with the Monstrous Rage to, deal even more damage with the double strike. Or we can use Hunter's Talent on level 2 to get a little bit extra power boost to some of our creatures when they swing in, and that'll make Violent Urge even better. But Hunter's Talent is the other, I guess I shouldn't say the Bushwhack's the only removal spell. This is also technically a removal spell, right? So, and it's a bite rather than a fight, which I trust a little bit more, especially with stuff like Terra and Patchwork Beastie, right? They have like relatively high power for what you're actually paying for them. So I kind of like that. But in any case, altogether a pretty solid main deck build. It's got Seed of Hope, obviously, too. Decks always pack this card. Another good turn 1 play, gains some life against aggro, and puts cards in your yard for delirium. As far as the sideboard goes, there's not too much interesting in here, right? Normal stuff, Abrade, Chandra, Lithomantic Barrage, Paw Patch Formation, Sunspine Links, towards the tower. But we've been seeing more Filigree Silex in sideboards lately. It blows up not only Corey Steel Cutter tokens dry, you don't have to have any oil counters on it, but it also blows up cutters some of the time, right? But it's also sort of once in future against the various, blue, black, and mono black piles. And I guess it gets you through some of the blue stuff and like, is it cutter, right? But I think this is mostly for, off matchups like blue-black. But Twin Moss Stormbrew might look weird, but we see a lot more of this lately too, because it's just a really cheap removal spell for decks like this that can take out 5 toughness creatures, even if you can't ever cast a Twin Maw. And I think the only way of doing that is by flipping Terra over and getting her all the way to Chapter 4, but still, altogether, I like Terra as an addition to this deck, and I like Summon Brynhildr too. I think it gives us some dimension and card draw that we didn't really have before. That's good, but Terra gives the deck what it was really, really missing. It's already trying to do it with Omnivorous Flytrap, but Terra is an even better sort of mid to late game engine. The game stalls out a little bit more than we wanted to. Terra can win the game, not just by flying over, but there's a couple of tricks like FOMO and Violent Urge to make us close the game out like almost immediately once we untap with the big one in play. So altogether, pretty good. Deck has a little bit more dimension now than it had before. I think we've done like 12 of these top 3 new decks of the week. And this is the 3rd time a Grul Delirium deck has shown up. So how new can it be? Well, in this case, we got multiple FF cards in it, and both of those cards, again, I think bring dimension to the deck it didn't currently have. So I'm a big fan of that. But we'll move on to deck number 2, Mono Black Cecil over here. We've actually just done a deck tech for Mono Black Cecil. I don't know which pronunciation you prefer, but in any case, well, check that out. That deck was built slightly differently than this one, but not that much differently. And this is actually the most successful deck of the week. Multiple challenge appearance, a couple of different, 5-0 league results, but this one we're looking at here is the best of all of them, results-wise at least. This got 2nd place in an MTGO challenge over here, which is pretty good. Built by and piloted by Poker's Wizard, I believe was the name of the player. So really good job. Broke out with a brand new deck this week. Now, Cecil Dark Knight is a 1-mana 2/3 Death Touch that turns over once you hit half your starting life total into a 4/4 lifelink. And he also gives all your other guys indestructible when he attacks, just like this is where we are in Magic now, that this is a 1-mana investment. Gets you all this. So obviously a powerful card, and it's not just popping up here. This is popping up in the blue-black decks with like the Enduring Curiosity, Kaito, Spyglass Siren, or whatever it's called. So this is popping up in multiple decks. Say popping up again. This is showing up on multiple things this week already. That's pretty cool, man. It's a 4 of in this deck, but a 2 of in the blue-black piles. And I understand why, but we are focused a little bit more on Cecil in this deck. We've got stuff like Dark Confidant, another new card, sort of. Printed in Final Fantasy. We couldn't play it last week. So, this also helps out with the Cecil. We keep our curve relatively low, so we shouldn't be taking too much damage to Dark Confidant. Deep Cavern Bat is the best black 2-drop in Standard. Gix is our Enduring Curiosity variant. Helps us draw a bunch of cards. Preacher of the Schism, this will also draw us cards, but it also helps us get lifelink creatures to kind of keep up with, the crackback from mono red. I like that about it. Sheldred is a nice mid to late game engine that gives us a form of reach that can end games for us, but also gain some of the life back that we've lost. And then Tiny Bones is both really good at attacking and blocking. Which I like that about him. He's probably better with Gix in the deck than, say, something like Gas Guzzler, Forsaken Miner, or any of the other 1-drops that we have access to, except maybe Fairy Dream Thief, which I'm interested in this spot. But still, Tiny Bones makes a lot of sense. He's actually a pretty powerful card for just 1 mana. Apart from that, the real secret weapons in the deck are, of course, its removal. Go for the throat, cut down. We got to play those. Gix's command at the very top end to blow out mono red and Izzet Cutter and stuff. But then Duress and Dreams of Steel and Oil. So Duress can take Corey Steel Cutter on turn 1. It can take their Reanimator spell on turn 1 against Omniscience. It can mess with enchantments and artifacts, obviously. Planeswalkers if they have a Kaito and you're up against blue-black. This can take a lot of the most important cards in the format away from opponents, even against aggro decks. It takes their Cutter, like I said, but it can also take their Monstrous Rage and stuff like that. Dreams of Steel and Oil can take their Cutter away and exile it forever, which is sick, but also creature cards. So that's great against, again, any of the Cutter decks in Standard. So not really surprising to see these 2 discard spells doing kind of a lot of the heavy lifting, I think, in this deck. When we tested a mono black Cecil deck to do the deck tech, it turns out that 4 main deck Duresses were kind of the secret sauce. They're kind of like the best thing you could be doing in the deck. So, and we've seen a lot of other decks. There was a green-black deck this week that had a couple of brand new cards in it, but it also leveraged 4 Duress. The blue-black decks are including main deck Duress now. This is maybe the best card in the format. It really is. We've shaped things in this meta to this point where Duress is that good. So if you're playing Swamps, play some Duress in the main. Apart from that, 21 lands is it. 20 lands on a Fountain Port. And then the sideboard here is, what you'd expect. Ghost Vacuum against Omniscience and such. Dreams of Steel and Oil against Cutter. Gix's command to blow out red decks. Liliana of the Veil, interestingly. More Filigree Silex. Again, more people playing that recently. Carsey Revenant against red decks. And Shoot the Sheriff to have another sort of unconditional removal spell. But altogether, it's cool to see mono black aggro actually back. No islands needed. You know what I mean? We're not doing that. We're not playing as much of a tempo game or anything. We're just trying to kind of get them. We have, Gix and Dark Confidant and Preacher to draw cards in the main deck. That is a lot of card draw for an aggro deck. We have Deep Cavern Bat, Duress, and Dreams of Steel and Oil to take cards away from the opponents. So we're actually lined up pretty well in this format against both Omniscience, Cutter, and I guess to a third degree if you want to include mono red and red X variants that aren't Cutter. So that's a pretty good spot to be in the format, and I think that Poker's Wizard had to help prove that over the last few days by getting 2nd place in an MTGO challenge populated by mostly Cutter decks and stuff. So, the deck is pretty well positioned. Cecil is better against mono red by himself than he sort of looks like he would be. So, deck might actually be the real breakout deck of the past week. So I wanted to bring it to you. But again, check out that deck tech if you haven't yet. But my favorite deck of the week, by far, is Yuna.deck. Abzan Yuna, I guess we'll call it here. So this is kind of a variant in some ways of the Zur, up the beanstalk Overlords decks, right? But it isn't that. I guess we're just trying to maximize Yuna. If you haven't seen her yet, 5 mana for a 3/5 during your turn. Both her and enchantment creatures you control have lifelink, trample, and ward too. Here's the cool part. At the beginning of your end step, you just get to reanimate an enchantment with a finality counter. So as we discussed in previous season, probably the best thing you can do with that is just play Overlords. And that is what Sandile did here in an MTGO league on the 14th of June, just a day ago, as I record this. And all of these are from the 14th or the 13th, so pretty fresh results as I recorded at least. So that said, Yuna, a card a lot of people speculated on when she first came out, and I'm glad that she's shown up, not just here, but these the Zur decks, the domain decks, I guess if you want to call them that, are currently playing the 1-of Spira. Some of them are even up to a 2-of Hope of Spira. So Yuna's seen play in multiple decks over the last 5 or 6 days here. So that's pretty promising results, But this is the only one where she's really kind of the star of the show. You play the play set. And there's a couple of other new cards here, We've got Overlord of the Balemerk, Overlord of the Hawwoods, Overlord of the Mistmoors. So we're playing all of the good overlords in our color combination. But we are also playing Summon Fenrir, so we have 8 different 3-mana ways of ramping on turn 3. That's kind of neat, but this does a lot more. This, we should have a pretty huge creature when it pops off on chapter 3, because we've got all these huge, overlords in the deck. So if we have any of those out, then suddenly we should draw a card. And a 3-mana 3/2 ramp and draw a card, and sometimes even get a +1/+1 counter on an already large creature. That's all really good for the rate that you're paying for it. So, that gives us, this deck maximizes enchantments. I was talking about how the Terra deck, it's weird, it doesn't play that many. This has, just how many on this page? 4, 8, 12, 16, that's a lot. So, Yuna's great with all of these, effectively. These are high-profile removal targets, so if your opponent does burn a Get Lost or some other removal spell on any of these, then Yuna can just get them back, effectively, the turn she comes into play. And she's protected because of the ward. The thing you get back is protected because of the ward. All fantastic. All fantastic. They have lifelink, my goodness, and it's only during your turn, but having lifelink is a huge deal when you're swinging in with guys this enormous, But we also play Primal Odin in the deck, so this can get reanimated, come into play, and immediately just blow up a creature they control. Pretty cool. But it also just wins the game. On chapter 2, if it swings in, it just wins the game. If it goes unblocked, that's pretty cute. But on chapter 3, this is a card draw piece that also deals a little bit of damage to everybody. So cool stuff there. We only need to play a couple of copies of this card, but I really like the include. Just very cool. We also have Go for the Throat and Cut Down as full 4-ofs, as you may expect, but Dredger's Insight is in here to mill enchantments into our graveyard. It too is an enchantment, I guess, so that's kind of neat. It can find creatures or lands for us. Nowhere to Run is also an enchantment. Virtue of Persistence can be reanimated by Yuna if it goes into our graveyard. That's very cool. So a lot of cool stuff going on in the main deck of this thing, man. I really want to give this one a spin, more so than the other decks that we've looked at, because I've already kind of played Cecil for a few days now, right? And had him proxied up before the set came out. So, and as far as Grul Delirium goes, I really like the inclusion of Terra, but I've just got an eye on that deck. This is the one. The Yuna deck is the one I want to play. We've also got Starting Town in here, so it's not like just Yuna from Final Fantasy. We've also got this thing in here, which makes plenty of sense in a sort of 3-color mid-range deck where you really need all of your colors, right? Like, we only have like 10 lands capable of casting an Overlord of the Mistmoors. So that's, but we can just reanimate it with Yuna. We can make, we can find a Plains maybe with Fenrir. We can definitely make my white mana with Overlord of the Hauntwoods. So that makes casting stuff like Overlord of the Mistmoors a little bit easier, but we still, Starting Town helps out a lot with lines like that. As far as the sideboard goes, there's the Duress. It's just going to be in every deck with Swamps, somewhere in the 75, so it's not too surprising to see. Ghost Vacuum against Omniscience and other Reanimator piles. Maelstrom Pulse, because we can play it, is really, really good against Cutter decks and stuff. Obstinate Baloth against Pixie decks. We've got Scavenging Ooze in here, again, against Omniscience. Just a really bad matchup for a kind of mid-range deck that wants to win on turn 6. Omniscience is a combo deck that wins on turn 4 or 5, so you just cannot win against Omniscience. You have to have a few different things that can do stuff against it. Terra Sunder can blow up just about anything, literally. And then Tranquil Throwback over here, again, messes around in graveyards and stuff, but can also blow up Quarry Steel Cutters. So a lot for this to do in Standard right now, to say the least. So really cool sideboard here. I think it's doing a lot of heavy lifting against a lot of important decks in the format, but just look at the main deck again. This might be the way to play Reanimator in Standard. Overlord of the Belmerk and Dredger's Insight are both great mill pieces for something like this. I like that a good bit, but apart from just that, it's a strong deck to just play out on curve. Cut down and Go for the Throat, cover your butt on turns 1 and 2, or you can Dredger's Insight on turn 2. You can curve out with Overlord of the Belmerk into Overlord of the Hauntwoods on turn 3. So, again, even if all you're doing is curving, you're playing strong cards the entire time. And you got good removal and stuff in here too. 10, 12 total removal spells. That's pretty good stuff. If you want to count the Odin, I guess you've got 14. But, overall, man, just, again, a strong-looking deck. No Beanstalk required either, which is good news considering probably going to be a ban announcement we know there's going to be a ban announcement in like 3 or 4 weeks. And Beanstalk is halfway expected to be in that. So seeing a deck like this that doesn't leverage Beanstalk, even though it could, to 4, 8, 9, 10, 12, 16 cards at least, plus Virtue, 18 cards that trigger beans, it could be in here, but They just didn't find room for it. They wanted to jam Yuna and do all the cool things, and they did it. So, congratulations, Sandile. You have my deck of the week this week. But I guess as an honorable mention, I will also say that even though they weren't in new decks, both Vivi Ornitier, I've played FF9. I've just never even known this was his last name. But anyway, Vivi is showing up as either a 2 or sometimes a 4 of even in these Is It Cutter decks. We kind of expected that to happen, but there were a lot of naysayers. I see people in the comments, I saw at least one person being like, I don't see anyone bad mouthing Vivi. I did. The spikes on Reddit, even people in just the normal, r/Magic TCG Reddit. There were a lot of folks saying that they did not know that Vivi would be good enough. For standard, it's a little bit slow. It costs a whole 3. It's a 0/3. It's fragile, and all the same things that people say. But Vivi again is showing up as a play set in these decks at times, and at the very least a 2 of. So definitely has been important. But a card that's been a little less important, but still showing up in these cutter decks, is Astrologian's Planisphere. So 2 mana for an equipment that equips for 2, but has job select, so it comes into play with a 1/1 guy on it. The equipped creature gets whenever you cast a non-creature spell, and whenever you draw your 3rd card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So you're probably not going to draw 3 cards very often, but you are going to cast a lot of non-creature spells. So this works with Vivi. You often see these in the same decks kind of together. But even apart from Vivi, this works pretty nicely on basically everything that you have. It gives it a form of permanent prowess, you know what I mean? Like prowess, but instead of normal prowess, +1/+1 counter. And even if, you lose the creature and Planisphere kind of gets reset, it goes back on any creature very, very well. You throw this on a Slick Shot Show Off, and you cast 1 Monstrous Rage, and suddenly that boy is enormous. And the +1/+1 counter from this is a part of that. So the +2/+0 that it got when you played this in the first place is a big part of that. So again, kind of interesting to see Planisphere show up here. I thought it was a pretty powerful card, but I was not sure. I just wasn't quite convinced that it was, all the way, that it made it, right? But this is showing up in about every 3rd Is It Cutter deck, which is pretty impressive considering how optimized we thought that deck was, right? So just kind of want to give these honorable mentions and shout them out. These are both pretty important new cards in standard. But anyway, that's all I've got for this week on Top 3 New Decks of the Week. Actually doing stuff with Final Fantasy cards. Interesting. But anyway, do all the stuff. Let me know about any cool decks you've seen out there in the wild. And check out that like button. It does stuff. Same thing with the subscribe button. It does things. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but it does things. You can also check out the Patreon. $1 a month to support the channel. That's all I ask. And you can vote on content over there too, if you're a member. But anyway, guys, just hit me up in the comments section with any of your thoughts, and I will catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, Wizards. Spread love and be kind.